Hi, welcome to the Praiseland Media PMBOK Guide Audio Digest Users Group. Those users of the PMBOK Guide Audio Digest who have been studying project communications management probably have questions on the power interest grid. In our forums, we talk about the PMBOK Guide 4th edition and try to further understand other areas that might otherwise not be discussed in most tutorials. Today we're looking at the power interest grid for stakeholders. In this figure, you can see we have on the y-axis power and on the x-axis interest. This matrix diagram is used to keep tab on stakeholders who can make or break the project, and also stakeholders who we may just need to inform. In the typical project, you have people who are very curious about how the project is progressing, people within the department, people in the organization, even people external to the organization whose interest may be positively or negatively impacted by the project, want to know more about what is happening. For that reason, the power interest grid can be very useful. You can see the different variables from A to H represent the different stakeholders on the project. So stakeholder A needs to be kept informed. At the same time, his interest level is kind of in the middle of the project and his power is just below average. We look at someone like stakeholder C. His power level is above average, his interest level is below average, but as far as keeping him satisfied, we need to keep him on the radar. This is a good way in projects where you have several stakeholders to keep tab on them and make sure that you as a project manager understand what they want, when they want it, and the amount of effort that you need to keep tab on these stakeholders. They can make or break your project. All it takes is for one key stakeholder not to have been informed about a critical decision to break your project. That is why several tools talked about in the PMBOK Guide 4th edition are very useful in managing these stakeholders. For that reason, Identify Stakeholders has been added as a process in the 4th edition. Now let's talk about some other areas in the PMBOK Guide in today's session. Looking at the table, by now you should know page 43 in the PMBOK Guide. This is a very important table to understand. Moving down to project communications management, you can see that the Identify Stakeholders process is right at the beginning in initiating. The reason is because before you even proceed in identifying all your requirements and collecting them, you need to have understood who is important in this project and who you need to invite to the kickoff meeting and who you need to engage as early as possible. Because the moment the project charter is developed, you move into having your kickoff meeting to discuss with stakeholders that you have identified how you will begin to plan the project. So this is a very important step. You absolutely need to identify these people. You need to keep them on radar right from the beginning and all through the project. You need to keep an assessment of if these people have become more powerful. Perhaps one of the stakeholders suddenly becomes a VP or CEO. They could have more power as the project proceeds. So you absolutely need to keep tab on them and identify their interests throughout the project. For that reason, the Manage Stakeholders process has been moved into the Executing process group. Those of you who studied the PMBOK Guide 3rd edition remember that we had this process under the Monitoring and Controlling process group. But it makes sense to have this in Executing because you're actually carrying out the plan. Remember, plan communications is your plan for managing stakeholders. So in Executing, we know that we carry out plans that we create in the planning process group. So here you're really carrying out the plan, keeping tab on the stakeholders, having those weekly meetings with them. In some projects, stakeholders could appear extreme. For example, in a Scrum project, we had stakeholders, senior management, who wanted to be in every single Scrum meeting early in the morning, 15 minutes. They could sacrifice that time. So don't underestimate the interest level of your stakeholders. You need to keep them updated as regularly as possible. Now, not only are stakeholders at times difficult to manage, sometimes their reporting requirements could be hard to manage. Sometimes you have stakeholders who want reports updated throughout the project, all throughout the day, end of the day report. And this is typical on construction projects where stakeholders are very keen on understanding what happened and how quickly the work is proceeding. In other projects, they may not need that level of detail, but in engineering projects, especially very rigorous projects, you have stakeholders who have actually been assigned to manage the work as a project manager on their end. So you as the project manager on the end of the performing organization need to manage the interest level of those project managers, and they could be very hard to manage. Moving on to talk about identify stakeholders at a very high level. Identify stakeholders involves identifying these entities, persons, groups or organizations that may be affected by the project. They could be within the same organization, they could be outside the organization, but it's important to identify them as early as possible. And also, the project manager needs to classify stakeholders, as we saw previously in the power interest grid, and also he needs to classify them to be able to identify whether they're critical for the project success or whether they're dormant stakeholders. You have stakeholders who just want to be informed. You also have stakeholders who can't do anything about their power or interest level. They're really just there because they're asked to be on the project by management to observe what's going on, and if anything goes out of line, they could blow a whistle. So you have stakeholders who could be passive, you have stakeholders who could be active, you have stakeholders who could be aggressive, and you have positive and negative stakeholders. This whole process enables the project manager focus on who is critical for the project's success. Now, the following should be documented in the Identify Stakeholders process. You want a list of stakeholders, list of roles and responsibilities. You need to know the location of the stakeholders. You need to understand their requirements at a high level even before you begin to collect requirements, and you need to have their contact information. So at a high level, that is what you need to understand about the Identify Stakeholders process. This could make or break your project. Identify these people early in the project, keep a tab on them throughout the project and the Manage Stakeholders process, and if you need to get support from any of these stakeholders, you need to win their confidence. The project manager needs to exert his interpersonal skills and lots of professionalism to convince these people that he indeed can handle the project and can handle their requirements, because all it takes is for one stakeholder to think that you cannot meet his needs. That could absolutely destroy your project. Thanks for your audience, and remember to check www.praiseion.com for more information on all the processes in project management.